How's it going, everyone? It is me, the Lone Vault Wanderer, back after a week of not making proper gaming news or discussions videos. And oh boy, this one is a doozy. We are talking about whether single-player linear narrative video games are dying out. And the reason why this has become so topical in the past day is because EA announced that they're closing down Visceral Studio. And once I read to you the statement they released today about the closure, you'll understand the connection between those two topics. So let's read this out and then we'll get into the discussion. EA stated the following: "Our Visceral Studio has been developing an action-adventure title set in the Star Wars universe. In its current form, it was shaping up to be a story-based, linear adventure game. Throughout the development process, we have been testing the game concept with players, listening to the feedback about what and how they want to play, and closely tracking fundamental shifts in the marketplace. It has become clear that to deliver an experience that players will want to come back to and enjoy for a long time to come, we needed to pivot the design. We will maintain the stunning visuals, authenticity in the Star Wars universe, and focus on bringing a Star Wars story to life. Importantly, we are shifting the game to be a broader experience that allows for more variety and player agency, leaning into the capabilities of our Frostbite engine and reimagining central elements of the game to give players a Star Wars adventure of greater depth and breadth to explore. This move leads to a few other changes. A development team from across EA Worldwide Studios will take over development of this game, led by a team from EA Vancouver that has already been working on the project. Our Visceral Studio will be ramping down and closing, and we're in the midst of shifting as many of the team as possible to other projects and teams at EA." So now you see the connection, right? The reason that EA gives for shutting down Visceral, who are probably most well known for the Dead Space series, the reason that they gave was the studio was developing a single-player narrative linear game that wouldn't allow for players to come back and enjoy for a long time to come. So it sounded like they were developing a game that was somewhat similar to Dead Space, for instance, but it seems like EA wanted something more Star Wars Battlefront 2 maybe, or maybe something open world, or something that is generally referred to as a game as a service. A game that's not necessarily not single player, but at least one that's not a linear narrative that has a story, and once you've finished that story, the game's over. You can't come back to it like a multiplayer game or a big open world game where you can do a lot of stuff, etc. So after this news dropped, a lot of people on Twitter were talking about this. Industry folk were talking about it, devs were talking about it, analysts were talking about it, and the discussion that I kind of gravitated towards was again whether this is another indicator that single-player linear narrative video games are dying out, as especially big AAA game developers and publishers are moving towards games as a service. For instance, Rami Ismail on Twitter stated that seems Visceral got shut over microtransactions, the popularity of sandbox/roguelikes, Twitch/YouTubers marketing, and publisher financials. I can see how financially in our current market, it makes little sense to AAA anything but a persistent online open world game with MTX, or microtransactions. Persistent social engagement and income, and if the game doesn't end, sustained free marketing via Twitch you can't get in linear games. Every linear single-player game from a published studio that comes out over the next 2 or 3 years is a miracle. Support them if you like them. And then in response to that, Daniel Ahmed, who is a games industry analyst, stated the following: "Too late, The Evil Within 2 already bombed. Other AAA single-player games that underperformed include Prey, Resident Evil 7, Dishonored 2, Deus Ex, etc. Someone asked, but Persona 5 did great. He responds with, "It's not a AAA budget game, it sold a couple of million. Unlike Battlefront, which sold greater than 16 million. Reality of AAA game development is it's expensive and publishers are looking for a return. That's why AAA is embracing the games as a service model." So, with all that out of the way, I can finally talk about this topic. And I'm going to re-emphasize the question: are single-player linear narrative video games dying out? Now, I want to be clear. We are not talking about single-player games generally. I know that when this topic comes up, people usually say, well, what about this game and that game and all these other games, when they're generally just listing single-player games. And I don't think the discussion has ever been or should be about single-player games generally, because of course, single-player games aren't going away, nor are open-world games, because they do phenomenally well as well. Assassin's Creed Origins is probably going to do really well. Fallout 4 was Bethesda's biggest game ever. Horizon Zero Dawn did very well, so I'm not talking talking about single player games generally, or open world games for that matter. What we're talking about, I'll re-emphasize, single player linear narrative video games. Video games like Wolfenstein or Dishonored or Bioshock that have a main campaign, are relatively linear in the story that they tell, aren't really open world, and once you finish the game, that's it, you're done, you completed with the story. Yeah, there might be slightly multiple endings, but for the most part, linear narrative single player video games are those that have that main campaign that you play through once typically, are relatively linear in their story and progression, and once you finish the story, there's no real incentive to play it again, unless there's a new game plus or something like that, or maybe you just really enjoyed the game. But again, we're talking about games like Dead Space, or Dishonored, or Resident Evil 7, or Evil Within, or Metro, Deus Ex, these kinds of games. Not open world, not just single player generally, these are the games I think the discussion should be about, because there is some data and evidence to suggest that 1, these games are becoming much more infrequent, and 2, when they do come out, when they are published, they don't seem to do too well anymore, comparatively anyways. Or maybe that's the case. We're going to get into that. And this might be a long video, and I apologize, but it's a topic that really interests me, and I tried to put the research into it, so I want to make sure I get everything right. Let's first be very, very clear about this topic. We are never going to have a concrete answer as to whether single-player linear narrative games are dying, because the reality is, 1, sales numbers, budget numbers, revenue numbers, profit numbers, they're rarely given for video games, and typically when they are, they're given when games hit a certain milestone. So we're never going to get weekly numbers on how many copies a particular game sells each and every week, but we might get an update like with Cuphead for instance, that sold 1 million copies. We typically get those big headlines when a video game sells 10 million copies or 15 million or whatever it is, but we don't have that continuous data, and we usually never have point-in-time data how many copies a video game has sold, which is only more complicated due to the fact that games sell on PC and on different consoles, etc. We just never really get those numbers consistently, so that causes a difficulty. Secondly, even if we had sales numbers, what do they mean? What does it mean when a game sells 1 million copies? What does it mean when a game sells 5 million copies? Those numbers on their own mean nothing. It means nothing to me that a game sold 5 million, because what if it made a loss? A game can still make a loss if it sold 100 million copies. The numbers that we really need to know about are margin of profit for each sale, the budget for the game, marketing costs, the cut that's taken by retailers and platform holders like Xbox and PlayStation, the distribution and packaging costs if the game had a physical release. There's so much other data that we need to truly determine whether a game performed well or not that we simply can't do even if we do have the sales numbers. Like, let's take Cuphead again as an example. The game sold 1 million copies. So what? That doesn't tell us that the game has done well. It doesn't tell us that the game has made a profit. Like, the game is $20 right now US on Steam. 20 times 1 million is $20 million, right? But that would be revenue. What's the profit on the game? We don't know, because we don't know the budget, we don't know the losses, we don't know anything like that. So that makes it difficult. Thirdly, a lot of the news articles that we get about video games doing poorly at physical retail can always be partly explained due to the continuous push into the digital market. There's been a lot of news articles over the past couple of years about games not doing too well at retail, like they're 30% down on the prequel or whatever it is. But that can always be partly explained due to the fact that the retail market, the physical retail market generally, is also on the decline, because more and more gamers are buying their games digitally online. And as more countries like Australia gets better internet, that's only going to be further facilitated. And finally, the fourth factor, and I'm sure there are many others out there, right? But the fourth factor is that it's very hard to compare a game that has just come out and say, look how poorly it performed in comparison to its previous edition. Because that previous game in the franchise has been out for many years. It's been selling for many years. It's had a lot of sales. It's probably much cheaper right now. So more and more gamers over the many years that it's been out have bought the game. So when those older copies have sold cheaply for so long and have very long tails, of course the likelihood is that those older copies are going to have more owners than the games that just came out, because they haven't had years to catch up. So all of those things and even more need to be borne in mind when we talk about this topic. So what is the best evidence? What is the best data that we possibly have when discussing the topic as to whether single-player linear narrative video games are dying. Number one, we have the anecdotal evidence on sales numbers. So again, when games reach a particular sales milestone, the publisher or developer will usually announce that. Or when services like NPD and GfK's Chart Track in the UK release their sales charts weekly. That kind of evidence we can use to imply how well a game is performing. It's not perfect, but it's there. Secondly, we can use Steam Spy. Now, usually, websites that try and track the sales of video games like VG Charts are always so inaccurate. They're really inaccurate. Unless you're looking at hard NPD or GfK data, you are never going to know how many copies a game is actually sold. But Steam Spy at least has some accuracy when it uses Steam's OpenAPI data. It can actually track with relative accuracy the number of owners games on Steam actually have. And we know this is accurate because some developers have actually asked Steam Spy to take down the pages for their games because they're really accurate, and some developers don't want that data public. But of course, the downside is that it's just PC data. We don't have console sales data, so that makes it even more difficult. So what we're going to do for this discussion is look at as much anecdotal evidence, news articles, and Steam Spy data as possible. And the specific way we're going to do this is looking at single-player linear narrative games that have come out fairly recently, like within the past, 3 or 4 or 5 years, and look at how those games compared to their previous counterparts. So for instance, looking at how Dishonored 2 has performed relative to Dishonored 1. Here and there we'll look at some single-player games that are standalone and don't have any previous additions, and just see whether generally those owner numbers look okay. But for the most part, we're going to do that comparison, and hopefully we can see how these single-player linear narrative games have performed over the years, because if we get a bunch of those games that continuously sell less and less and less, that could be an indicator that yes, single-player narrative games are starting to die out. But just bear in mind everything that I said before, because we're never going to have this answered concretely. And also as well, any reduction in sales could be explained by series fatigue. Maybe the sequel doesn't perform as well as the previous version because series fatigue is starting to kick in. We don't know. Alrighty, so let's look at Dead Space, and all the articles that I'm talking about will be linked in the description below. Today, GameSpot released an article about Dead Space and discussed how a former employee came forward to reveal details about Dead Space 2's budget and profitability. Apparently, the game, which sold on Xbox 360, PS3, and PC, cost $60 million to produce, going on to sell 4 million copies. And that developer added that EA was merciless with the budget for Dead Space 2, suggesting it could have been higher. And even though that's apparently a lot of copies, with marketing expenses are reported $60 million, and due to the portions that retailers get and the cut that Microsoft and Sony take from sales, it meant that Dead Space 2 didn't do well enough. There's an old article from GameSpot as well, where the EA CFO Blake Jorgensen said that the sales of Dead Space 3 came in below forecast. Dead Space 3 sold 605,000 units and was the top-selling title in the US during its February launch month, according to NPD data. But even then, the game came in below EA's forecast. And looking at Steam Spy data, Dead Space 1 has 2.3 million owners, and Dead Space 2 only has 1.4 million owners. That's about 1 million owners down from the previous game. Let's look at Dishonored 2. Dishonored 2, according to Eurogamer, failed to match the UK launch sales of its predecessor. Bethesda's game sold 38% fewer copies last week than the original Dishonored shifted back in 2012. Looking at Steam Spy data, Dishonored has 3.5 million owners on Steam, whereas Dishonored 2 only has 900,000 owners on Steam, down by over 2 million owners. How about Resident Evil 7? Well, over time the game has done pretty well, but PSU.com stated that Resident Evil 7 also failed to hit Capcom's internal expectations of shipping 4 million by March 2017. And the article also notes that Resident Evil 5 and 6 sold over 5 million copies each after 6 months on sale, whereas Resident Evil 7 is at about 4 million. And looking at Steam Spy, Resident Evil 7 Biohazard has close to 500,000 owners on Steam, whereas Resident Evil 6 has 1.3 million owners. Outlast 2, the original Outlast, has over 4 million owners on Steam, whereas Outlast 2 has 200,000 owners. on Steam. How about Bethesda's Prey? Well, MCV UK stated that Prey launched to mixed success in the UK. Despite making it to number 2 in the UK charts, it was still pipped to the post by Nintendo's Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, which enjoyed its second week at number 1 after its Switch release on April 28th. Remembering that Switch at that stage did not have that many units out there in comparison to all the consoles and platforms that Prey was on. And looking at Steam Spy, Prey has 460,000 owners. We don't have a recent previous version to compare it to, but those figures are there nonetheless. Evil Within, Eurogamer stated that the Evil Within 2 physical sales were 1/4 of the original game. On Steam Spy, Evil Within 1 has 700,000 owners, and Evil Within 2, even though it's early days, does not yet have 70,000 owners. How about the Metro series? A series that I absolutely adore. Metro 2033 has 4.7 million owners on Steam, and Last Light has just over 2 million. And lastly, Deus Ex. VG247 has an article talking about how the Deus Ex franchise is on pause, is on hold, because the last game sold poorly. The article states that Deus Ex Mankind Divided launched last year and was greeted with favorable reviews, but the sales numbers told a different story. Despite debuting at number 1 in its first week, the title didn't do nearly as well as its predecessor Human Revolution, and this has had predictable consequences. Eurogamer reports that the series has been placed on hiatus as a result. And looking at Steam Spy, Mankind Divided has over 800,000 owners, whereas Human Revolution had over 2.2 million. So, is this telling? Is this telling that single-player linear narrative games such as these are dying out because all of the data here seems to suggest that they are? Well, maybe not so much. Maybe let's look at BioShock Infinite, which sold 11 million units, which is more than the original BioShock, and BioShock 2 for that matter. On Steam Spy, Infinite has over 5 million owners, and 1 has not even reached 4 million owners. And what about Uncharted 4? Uncharted 4 has sold 8.7 million units, as reported by Forbes, and the previous game sales were estimated at about 5 million, 6.6 million, and 6.7 million respectively. So 8.7 is a significant leap. What about the Tomb Raider reboot? Initially, Square Enix said that the game did not meet its sales expectations. However, eventually they said that the game did pretty well. VentureBeat.com states that the Tomb Raider reboot is a year old, and Square Enix is celebrating by revealing that the game is a financial success. The publisher confirmed the game is on pace to sell 6 million units and will make more profit than originally anticipated. The head of studios, Daryl Gallagher, stated that having achieved profitability back in 2013, Tomb Raider has exceeded profit expectations and continues to make significant contributions to our overall financial performance. And then of course, even with these games, we don't have previous comparisons. Doom 2016 did well. It has over 2.3 million owners on Steam Spy. Wolfenstein: The New Order has over 1.7 million owners. Quantum Break, according to Microsoft, sold pretty well. And Persona 5 has hit 1.8 million copies globally. You see what I mean when I said that we're never really going to get a straight answer here? Because for every Dishonored 2, there's a BioShock Infinite. For every Dead Space, there's an Uncharted 4. For every Evil Within, there's a Tomb Raider. There could be so many reasons why the games that I mentioned before didn't perform as well as their predecessors. Maybe they weren't as good games. Maybe they had bad marketing. Maybe series fatigue started to kick in. Maybe it was a busy release window. We just don't know. And also as well, what I don't want this discussion to be about is us cherry picking certain single player linear narrative games that haven't sold well and saying, haha, that proves that the games are dying out. Because that's not the whole picture. After looking at all of this, my final opinion is that yes, I think there is somewhat of a trend with single player linear narrative games slowly losing relevance and getting less sales. I do not think this means that they're dying out, because they continue to come out, and some of them, like BioShock Infinite, Uncharted 4, Tomb Raider, Doom, Wolfenstein, Quantum Break, etc., they're doing well and they're meeting sales expectations. But even with that evidence, we can't discount what's happening to all these other games, and especially AAA publishers and developers developers accepting that they have to start embracing games as a service. We see this with Bethesda and Creation Club. They're saying we want another way to make money from our single player games. EA just proved it by closing down Visceral. 2K and Take-Two is proving it with all of the online content for GTA that has never yet got its promised single player DLC. And then of course you have Warner Brothers with Shadow of War implementing microtransactions in a single player game. And whether gamers even like myself like to admit it or not, I do think that single player linear narrative games are losing somewhat of their relevance. I think it's too much of a stretch at this stage to say that they're dying. That's a very, very strong term. And there's too much evidence to suggest that that's true. But we simply cannot discount what has happened to games like Dead Space and Dishonored and Resident Evil 7 and Outlast and Prey and Evil Within and Metro and many other examples that I haven't mentioned. I think there's a risk the painting is on the wall, and as more of this news comes out, I can tell you that publishers and developers, being risk averse, are going to become continuously less likely to release games like this. So I don't think they're all going to die out completely. What I think is going to happen is that big AAA developers and publishers are going to move towards the games as a service model more and more as the years go on, and we will see less of these games from them. But this is where perhaps mid-tier developers and publishers will shine, with games for instance like Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. So overall, those are my thoughts. Holy shit, I've been talking for 43 minutes on my side. I have no idea how long this video is going to be, but I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you listened to the end. Please let me know in the comments below what you think, and until next time, this has been a raspy voice Lone Vault Wanderer, and please take care of yourself, and would you kindly keep fighting the good fight.